Okay, good morning, Al. Thanks for talking to us about Wellcome Open Research. I wonder if you could just introduce yourself briefly and tell us a little bit about your research.
Hi, I'm Al Edwards. I'm in the School of Pharmacy and my research focuses on biomedical technology, especially diagnostics and vaccine technology.
So has been very topical over the last year or so then.
Absolutely. And, and ironically, a couple of years ago, we were working on a vaccine against the coronavirus. So, you couldn't make it up, really. Yes, it's something we've been aware about and worried about for a long time.
So why did you decide to publish your work on the Wellcome Open Research platform?
So I've published twice now on the Wellcome Open Research platform, and for slightly different reasons. The first time was actually pandemic related. It was essentially a methodology. It wasn't a study protocol, but it was a methodology paper talking about a methodology for testing things during a pandemic. So it seemed like an excellent place to put that work out. And it did build on work that we had done a few years ago, funded by the Wellcome Trust. So that made us eligible. But pandemic aside, more recently, I published for a slightly different reason in that platform. And that was that was definitely work that was funded by the Trust. And it was a kind of paper that you might struggle to publish elsewhere because it was more like a transparent, open report about a systematic analysis of a whole bunch of different, in this case, cameras, where it wasn't like we discovered something amazingly exciting, but we wanted the data to be openly available and accessible to everyone.
Great, thank you. So can you tell us a bit about how this platform works? Because I understand that you publish first and then get peer review in later.
So yes, I think it's a platform that is entirely logical, but because it's not a very normal, conventional way of doing it and nobody's used to it, that makes it probably more difficult than it needs to be. So the idea is that it's combining the preprint archive with the final paper all in one go, and also making all the reviews entirely transparent and viewable. So the process is quite simple. You write your article as you would do normally. There are a few extra requirements. So for example, instead of having electronic supplementary information, you have to include everything in the main article, which makes sense, although there is a risk that the paper becomes too long that way. You then upload it and it goes through some checks, and the checks are almost all about accessibility and transparency. So to make sure that if you've said that your data is available, they will check that the data is available. So that does take a week or two to go through those checks, and you might have to change some things and do some more work on your bibliography, but then it's published and it's made available. And then it goes through a peer review process. And when people finally get around to reviewing it, their reviews are published with the article. And then if there's a recommendation to change it, you can then submit a new version, which is effectively a version 2, and then it will go through that review process again. And then hopefully eventually enough reviewers will approve it that it becomes an officially peer-reviewed version of your original preprint.
And I think your comments to the reviewers are made open as well, aren't they?
So when you make a response, you will also write down, as well as revising the article and submitting a new version, you get to write a narrative to say, thank you for this comment, this is a good point, but so and so. So instead of it all being done in private with only being reviewed by an editor of a journal, everything that's written is openly available. And so people can look at the comments and they can look and see what other people think of the strengths and limitations of your work. So that's the idea. In theory, it's a great idea.
The peer reviewers are still invited, aren't they? It's not kind of crowdsourced.
So the way that it works is that I believe, I've not worked as an editor of a journal, but I believe it's a similar process, that you get a combination of author-suggested reviewers, but also reviewers who are identified through the process of essentially looking at the subject material. And I think a lot of it's done electronically, which makes sense. So based on keywords that you have in your paper, they will identify suitable reviewers. And I think the only thing you can do is, for example, I suspect that you have an option of discounting recommended reviewers, but it is a kind of curious process because you go through this process of making lots of recommendations. The journal platform will then send out invites to review, And of course, as with any other reviewing process, most people haven't got time and don't choose to review things. So that's it's the same problem as any other peer-reviewed article, is that finding people who've got time to do the reviewing process is always difficult.
So did you have any concerns about the peer reviews being open?
So funnily enough, my biggest concern about open peer review is that I've thought about what it would be like to write a peer review that was published. Now, when I review articles, I always like to think that what I write is reasonable. However, I do tend to rush the actual text and writing. If it was going to be publicly archived and published forever, I would probably spend a few more hours on that review, making sure that it was really defensible, really clearly written, and really appropriate, because essentially I'm writing something to publish as opposed to a private judgment. And I think that makes the reviewing process even harder, because I think even fewer people are going to have time to complete that peer review, because the review is essentially a published item as well. And I think until the culture changes and people get more used to it, that is going to be a real barrier. So I'm more worried that it's very hard to get an article like that reviewed, because nobody really wants to write an open review, than worried about what other people's comments are about my work. Because I'm very comfortable that if people have a comment about my work, which is unreasonable and in the public domain, I don't mind, because I can explain why it's unreasonable, and then we can have a fair and open debate. So I'd much rather that if there was an unreasonable comment made about my work, that was public, than if it was private. Because if it's private, you've got no recourse.
Yeah, that's a really good argument for kind of open peer review. So I can see the first of your papers was published in March, but it hasn't got any peer reviews yet. So you've mentioned that the platform does work with you to recruit suitable reviewers.
Okay, so we had two. One was in 2020. It was in it was in the summer of 2020, and it took a long time, but eventually we got a couple of peer reviews, and it was slower than and most of the other journals, but it was still a slow process. And of course, it has the bonus that it's already out there and you have the date of publication, even whilst you're waiting for a review. And of course, nobody's going to blame you for it being slow. They're all going to see, well, no wonder it took a long time, because nobody reviewed it. So the second one, I think, because of the time that I put it on there at March this year, I wouldn't necessarily even expect reviews by now, because it is such a slow process. There is one additional catch, which is that I believe that you need to go onto the platform fairly regularly to suggest reviewers. And if you don't do that, it takes even longer, because nobody's being invited to review. So perhaps I haven't had time to do that. Whereas normally that would be an editor's job, and the editors are under pressure to get the turnaround time for their articles. So I don't think there's an ideal system, but yes, you need to be patient, I think.
You've mentioned a little bit about data. So did you have to provide the underlying data for the publication? And if you did, how did you do that?
So yeah, so it's one of these really strong rules and guidance notes for these articles, is everything that you do should ideally be shared. Now, of course, that's not true, because there's so much data that isn't of a nature that can be shared, because people would argue that the raw data isn't meaningful in itself. But it turns out that it's relatively easy to publish your data, because we have fantastic support at the University of Reading. And actually, for the first article, we used a university repository that was very straightforward to set up, not least because we had so much guidance on how to do that. And what that meant was that by the time we had that university repository set up, we'd gone through all of the checks and quality checks and labeling checks that you would need. Which meant that then when we submitted to the Wellcome Open Research Platform, because we'd already got everything lined up and correct, there wasn't any problem. But it is also possible to use external platforms. Some of these are very easy to use. And if you use a platform which is recommended by the publisher, what they're going to do is check, is there a DOI? Does it actually really exist? Does the data actually there? And to check that there's a basic compliance with their guidance for data having the appropriate labeling, and not being just completely random stuff that you can't connect through to the article. So I think that's reasonably straightforward, and I think it's a worthwhile process if you have any type of data that could ever be shared and reused.
Great, thank you. So have you had any reaction or feedback to the papers that you've published on this platform, and have you produced updated versions in response to the peer reviewers?
So we haven't done the update yet for the one that's been through that whole process, mainly just because of sheer pressure of having so many articles to review for so many revise for so many other things. So that's a good thing. And I guess the really cool thing would be with that paper, if because it was a methodology paper, if we get to the point of being able to publish the real discovery research based on that methodology, then that would be the point at which it would be very positive, because we could argue that having had the method out there allowed us to then go out and use that method to benefit society and actually work on solving a real problem. But that's for the future, and we can't say for sure. And of course, it's an uncertain area because there's lots going on and things are rapidly changing with COVID. So if it doesn't come to anything, it won't be for lack of trying, and it won't be because of the platform. It will be just because of the nature of things, that things just don't always work out how you hoped.
Yeah. And I forgot to ask, but did you have to pay an APC to publish on this platform?
So I guess that was another motivator for putting it onto the Wellcome platform, is that anyone who's had Wellcome funding for the work that they've done automatically gets that article published. And of course, that is a condition of it, but the bonus is then you don't have to pay an additional fee. So yes, that wasn't a problem for this particular journal.
Great. So do you have any advice to anyone else thinking of using the same platform or a similar platform?
So my basic advice is give it a go. Have a look at the type of articles are out there. And actually, it's quite interesting that quite a lot of the articles are different from the types of articles you might see in other journals. For example, they might be study protocols or prospective planning articles, or they might be wider, more sweeping articles, which are would be very difficult to put into a traditional academic journal format, maybe because they're longer than usual, or because they contain a lot more sort of subsidiary analysis that many journals would just say, well, that's not relevant, that's boring, we don't want to see that. So I would suggest go for it, but do be patient and just assume that it's going to be slow to get reviews, but then that's true for other articles anyway. So what's the problem?
Great, thank you very much. That was a really interesting interview.